In John's Gospel, in the 2nd chapter, at verse 13, please. John's Gospel, chapter 2. Now, we're getting ready. I think you could see that. We're going to look at some of the signs that Jesus did, some of the healings he did, some of the other things that he did that turned out to be signs of what God was doing and who Jesus is. And he proved these things. The first sign was at the wedding in Galilee. That one was a little bit difficult because we had to kind of picture what was going on at that wedding. This one is worse because there is no way in my imagination or yours that we could picture what was going on at Passover time in Jerusalem and what upset Jesus so much that he would turn the money changers' tables over and drive out those that bought and sold of the sacrifices that were to be offered. In chapter 2, verse 13, and the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now he is at Capernaum. He has gone from Cana to Capernaum, which has by this time evidently become his own place, his own city. And nothing else is heard of Nazareth from him. Some people talk about him and say, well, how can anything good come out of Nazareth? But Jesus doesn't talk about it anymore. It's Capernaum always after this time. He was at Capernaum, and the Bible says he didn't stay there very long. And then he went to Jerusalem. I know I mentioned this before probably, but it's always curious to me. He went up to Jerusalem south of where he was, by many miles. And the Bible's always telling us that somebody went up to some place, no matter where they were, whether it was up or down or whatever. And then every once in a while you run into something that says they went down to a place. And often that doesn't make any sense with us down up. Somebody told me the one expression was from Judah and the other expression was from the area up around Galilee. Anyway, he went to Jerusalem and found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves and the changers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured the money changers' money out and overthrew the tables. And said unto them that sold doves, take these things hence, make not my Father's house an house of merchandise. All his disciples remembered that it was written, that the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. Then answered the Jews and said unto him, what sign showest thou unto us, seeing that you do these things? Jesus answered and said unto them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and wilt thou rear it up in 3 days? But he spoke of the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this unto them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. Now, Jesus has done a very remarkable thing here. He has gone into the temple. He has driven out the people who were there. In fact, he emptied the temple at the time of the Passover. Now, everybody in John's day, when he wrote this, would understand what just happened. But it's very difficult for us because we don't have anything to compare to Passover. The cleansing of the temple had cause, and it had a result. The cause is the thing we will look at first. Why? Why was this done? It was a sign, of course, of something that had changed and was changing, and before their eyes was going to be different than it had ever been before. But what was so terrible about it that he had to throw everybody out of the temple? And when we consider that everybody left the temple, we have no concept of a crowd of that size unless we look at one of the major crowds that has happened at some great event in this country. It happened carefully planned in Israel every year at Passover time. If we look at it for a moment, the first sign was that Jesus' blood supersedes the waters of purification. The water pots at the Cana, at the wedding, contained water for purification, the Jewish ceremonial purification. That became wine. That became representative of the blood of Christ. The blood of Christ was now the thing that would cleanse. So that sign was set. Now the sign is Jesus supersedes the temple. If you remember, the temple traces back now to the wilderness tabernacle. You remember in the days of Moses? It was a portable temple, a tabernacle that they could tear down and take with them, and when they moved and set it up again, they stay maybe a month or 2 months in a place that with this all set up, and they would use it as worship. But in the tabernacle, there was between the cherubim, the Ark of the Covenant, and God's throne was that ark. He lived between the cherubim in the wilderness tabernacle. Now I say he lived there, he lives everywhere, but you know what I mean. This was the place designated as the throne of God. Well, the temple grew out of that. Wilderness tabernacle was fulfilled when the temple was built. This is not Solomon's temple now. That one has been replaced with this one. Still, the idea is that it's God's house. Jesus said here, my house is called a house of, my Father's house is called a house of prayer. And these people had desecrated it. So this was still God's house, and Jesus represents that house because Jesus is the temple. He is the one worshiped. He is the one who is the power here. So this is the sign that Jesus replaces the temple. He calls his body a temple in that sense. And this is what will be established. But here are the circumstances where all this happened. Oh, no, I need to mention one more thing before we get there. John is the only one who mentions this cleaning of the temple. Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't mention it. But in the last week of his ministry, about 3 years from this time, Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell of his cleansing of the temple in that last week of his ministry. And John doesn't mention that one. How many people have said, well, now, wait a minute, that means that John's is not true. This is not what happened. Yes, it happened, a cleansing when he began his ministry, and he cleansed the temple again to complete his ministry. But remember, we talked once about 4 Gospels. Why are there 4 Gospels? A lot of them have the same things in them. Sometimes it'll have this event here in Matthew, and over here in Luke, it will have happened somewhere else. It will have been stuck in somewhere else. The point was that each of these gospel writers, under God's direction, had a purpose in his gospel. And the things that we're told about are chosen in order to meet that purpose, to fulfill that purpose. And they are not necessarily in chronological order. Sometimes the Bible tells us that they are. This followed that. And another time, just this happened. And we're not told that it immediately followed that last event, or there was 6 months in between, or it really happened before the other event. We're told the things in order to meet the purpose of the gospel writers. John's purpose was to show us in the beginning that Jesus declared who he was, why he was here, what he was doing, and what would be changed. Now, if we look at this for just a moment, at the at the confusion that's going on at the time of the Passover. About a month beforehand, bridges had to be repaired, roads had to be brought up to date to repair as much as they could and cleaned up as much as they possibly could. You wouldn't believe anybody in that day would actually throw a Burger King wrapper by the side of the road or anything like that. The same, not the same sandwich, but the same thing. But everything had to be cleaned up spick and span because Jews came home for the Passover in great numbers. And now they've been scattered all over that part of the world, all over the Mediterranean area by this time. In 586, they were carried away to Babylon, remember, and many of those did not return to Israel to live. But being Jews, they came home to the Passover. And they're all over this area by now. They come from everywhere and they come in droves. Another thing that had to be done at this time was, excuse me. And this may look clumsy to you, but I'm doing you a favor. I just left out a bunch of stuff there. You can thank me for that later. That'd be okay. But they had all kinds of household duties connected with Passover. Many of those you've heard of. We're not going to talk about those right now, but that was enough to make you busy. It's like getting ready for Christmas. You've got a number of little things to do, and everybody is running and scurrying around. Now, all those things are added to this, but we're not going to discuss those right now. Just remember that they also happened. Now, about 2 weeks before the Passover, all the money changers, and they by the way, had set up in every town. And 2 weeks before the Passover, they moved to the sanctuary, to the temple, as many as could get in there, and others set up around because there was a big business for the money changers, as we shall see here in a moment. So 2 weeks before the arrival of worshipers to Jerusalem was figured, maybe 2 weeks before the Passover, the first ones would begin to come in. Reason for that was that if they had done anything to make themselves ceremonially unclean, they needed to have that 2 weeks' time to go through the purification process so they could take part in the Passover. Remember, a part of their preparation was they whitewashed all the sepulchres, because if someone had come even inadvertently into contact with one of those, he would have been unclean to participate in the Passover. If he came 2 weeks ahead of time and that happened, well, he had time to be purified ceremonially in order to worship at the Passover. Excuse me. There were a lot of taxes and fees that needed to be paid, and many of these were paid at the Passover time. One reason is all the money changers were around there, and you could shop for a good deal. You had to get a good exchange on the money. The money was very, very important in the Passover in Jesus' day. The money you spent, the money you used, the money that you were charged. And that money comes to the point as to why the whole thing was cleaned out in the first place. Jesus' target here, if you boil it down to a person, would be the high priest. Jesus has declared before everybody and before the high priest that they were at war. We'll try to get to a point that makes that clear as we go along. We mentioned the money changers because they were so important. Here's what happened. In the temple, all the things that had to be paid and all the money that had to exchange hands had to come, be approved, done, all finished before the Passover, or you could not participate. Now, the temple tribute, for example, was 1/2 shekel according to the sacred standard. Those are the words of the rabbis, according to the sacred standard. The standard, as we can understand, was equal to 1 Galilean shekel. The temple tribute was half 1 Galilean shekel. Now that had to be exactly a 1/2 shekel. You could not hand the man that you were paying, you could not hand him a shekel and have him give you change. Didn't work. You had to go to the money changers. Well, what money did you have to have changed? It depends on what you got in your pocket. All kinds of money circulated here. There was Palestinian silver. There were copper coins. There was Persian money, Tyrian money from the area of Tyre, Syrian money, Egyptian money, Greek and Rome. And if you had money from any of those places, it had to be transferred, it had to be changed for the 1/2 shekel. You come in, you have some Greek and money. You lay it on the table. Well, here's what I give you for that. That's worth 2 shekels. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Because the money changer was going to keep the profit, or at least a large part of it, or at least keep it for a little while, and I'll get to that in a minute. But he would give you what he thought your money was worth in Galilean money. And then that transaction would cost you, let's just put it into dollars so we can make some sense of it. Let's say that you had you had to pay $1, and all you had was a 5. Well, first, it's not worth $5. It's worth whatever the money changer thinks it's worth. So say you get 4 for it. So he gives you the $1 for the payment you have to make to the temple. And as soon as he does that, he gives you back $3. He gives you the 1 for the temple. And then out of the 3, he takes another one because he charges you for giving you the exact change so you can go pay whatever tax or toll or whatever it is that you need to do that for. Then you got 2 left. Well, you don't. You got 1 left because he's going to charge you for giving you change. So he gives you the coin or paper or whatever that you needed to make the exact amount to pay the temple. But then he charges you for giving you the exact amount, and he charges you for giving you change for that. You pay more to the money changer than you paid to the temple. The temple tax wasn't as big as a money changer's fee. It always had to be the precise amount. And then for each one of these different kinds of coins, there had to be figured some kind of exchange rate. And it may change from one man to another, from one money changer to another. How many people are doing this? Nearly everybody who comes into the temple. If anyone who hasn't been living in Galilee, which is the area in the north up around Cana and Capernaum, if he hadn't been living up there, he may not have Galilean money. He may not have a Galilean shekel. He may have to have his money changed. And people coming from other countries always had to have the money changed. They couldn't do anything in Jerusalem, or certainly nothing connected with the temple, until the money was changed to suit what was required there. Now, this looks like a terrible thing going on in here. Everybody yelling and screaming and arguing about money to pay the temple tax and to pay this and to pay that and to pay something else. Well, there's a further complication. Many people were buying sacrificial animals. The sacrificial animal had to be approved by an appointed, approved, that is government, that is high priest, approved examiner of these animals, because they could not have blemish. Well, the animals brought inside the temple were supposedly all clean and ready to go, but they still had to be examined, and you paid the examiner whatever fee he asked. If, in fact, he examined the animal and said this is unclean, can't be used. Well, now he just bought the animal inside the temple, but now it's been refused. So what's he going to do with it? He can't use it for the sacrifice. If he's going to make the sacrifice, he has to go through the whole process over again. And cheaper booths were set up outside. These were not inside the temple, but on the Mount of Olives and in the Temple Mount, but not inside the temple confines. And these booths were set up out there to sell animals. These animals, of course, it's approved. This animal's approved, animal's clean. Yes, sir. Well, if you buy that animal and take it in, you pay to have it inspected, and if the inspection turns out bad, you have another animal on your hand. Many people did it this way, though, because they buy the animal cheaper there and just take the chance on getting it approved. Many times the person who approved the thing would ask, "Where'd you get this?" And he must either lie and say he got it over yonder out of these animals that were already approved, or no, he didn't. He got it outside in one of the booths, and that almost guaranteed that it was not approved. Everybody crowded into the temple, yelling and screaming, and people stealing from one another in as much as they possibly could. It was permissible. Everything the money changers did in here, however despicable it may sound, was according to the law. They were allowed to do these things according to the law. They had made it a place where you could steal from your brother with impunity. You didn't have to pick his pocket. You didn't have to mug him. You didn't have to come up with some scheme to draw money from him because it was all legal. You could just do it this way. Now, the problem that Jesus had here, of course, was the unjust situation, but also, where did this money go? The money that was paid to the temple went into the temple treasury. Now, isn't that the way it ought to be? The temple treasury was, in fact, High Priest Annas' bank account. Some of the rabbis have estimated that they say at our rate. I don't know what that might be, whether they might have been up to date with this or not, but in modern terms anyway, millions were raised at the Passover every year. And all of it that went into somebody's account all went into the temple treasury, and that was ruled by Annas. Israel was wealthy, but Israel didn't have any money. Annas had money. He's the father-in-law of the high priest who crucified Jesus. He was also probably the mind behind the whole thing. The high priest, the Holy One in Israel, supposedly, was behind all this robbery and thievery. On the Mount of Olives, there were booths that sold bulls and sheep. Now, they were selling oxen and sheep inside the temple as well, but these were out on the Mount of Olives. They were owned by the sons of Annas, Annas being the high priest. They did as they pleased out there. If you bought something out there, there were no returns. You bought a sheep there, it was rejected, you just had it. And if you raised a fuss, you were beaten, because this was Annas' doing, and Annas' police, the police of the Sanhedrin, were on duty there because a lot of people griped, a lot of people complained, and they were there to keep order. And one of the things that they did, and 3 rabbis I found, all said this same thing, that one of the things that people suffered there was that a scourge was made of cords, and many people were whipped there because they got out of hand, and the police from the Sanhedrin would punish them like this. It explains why Jesus took a scourge of cords and drove the money changers out of the temple. Well, okay, we'll go one thing further here. Now, all the money changers' profits were taxed. And that tax also went into the temple treasury, or went to Annas, to the high priest. All money paid to the temple went to the temple treasury, which was controlled by the high priest. The temple treasury was the high priest Annas' bank account. Thus, Jesus, when he 3 years later cleanses the temple the second time, Matthew, Mark, and Luke write about it, and all 3 use the same words from Jesus. My house was supposed to be a house of prayer. You have made it a den of thieves. He called this whole process thievery, and he said they were a den of thieves. Now the word there suggests, if you put it in a Western movie, a hideout that was safe. They could steal from there and go to the hideout and be safe again. He made it a den of thieves. Now, one thing we're going to have to do right away, this is just on the side here. When we start on the 18th, we're going to start in Bible study with the idea that all the scripture that's written here about Jesus in the Old Testament, full of Jesus. How did those Jews in his day, when he came to Jerusalem, why did they not know him? Why did they not recognize this? How could they be so wrong? Well, this is part of it. This is where the leadership of the Jews was at the time that Jesus came. Annas was a very important political person. Of course, with all this money that he raked in, he bought a lot of favors from Rome. And really, he turned all those favors into another way to raise some money. The world had gone haywire. This world that Jesus came to. His sign to them is that temple is God's house. I am God. God dwells in me as he dwelt in that temple. And you have desecrated that temple. But it's not the thing anymore. Your temple worship is wasted and done. Worship me. And he threw this in their face, and there they are. They have to admit this is an act of God. This is an act that God would have done. This is what needed to be done. This was God at work, this Jesus. Now, how does Annas act about this? He knows this is right in his face. He knows that he's the one who's being accused here. And the Jewish people were aware of it. The rabbis who are writing at this time have nothing good to say about the high priest, nothing good to say about anything he's done. They hated him because he was preying on the people. But with all the money that was there, he was able to buy the favor of the law. He was able to buy the favor of Roman soldiers. He paid off a lot of people, and everything he paid off gained him another way to make some more money from the Jews. The Jews were being stolen from. You will notice through this thing, and although the account is short on details, you'll notice that Jesus nowhere blames the people who are in the temple trying to buy and sell. Trying to buy these things that are being sold. Nowhere does he condemn them, because this is what they've been forced to do if they're going to worship in the Passover. If they're going to observe this time, they're going to have to do it this way, because the high priest has made it so you can't do it any other way. Jesus nowhere in here runs down the people. Nowhere does he blame the people. The blame is all clearly aimed at the one who sits in the Sanhedrin and calls himself the boss. Jesus, it may seem to us, puts up with a lot of nonsense in this world. Old Billy Sunday used to stand right here. I'm not going to do this, please. Used to stand right here and leap up onto this pulpit and say, "If I were God for a day." he wouldn't put up with the nonsense God puts up with, it seems. But there comes a day when there's a payday. There comes a day when the things that we've done and the things we need to do and the things we ought to do all come together and rush again on our minds, and we come to understand that God is not going to put up with this any longer. If Israel wonders what is the matter with that nation today, even though it's coming to the blessing of the end times that promised it, they rejected Jesus. And it's not very hard, people, to take this from that setting, from that kind of culture and practices and so forth, and transfer it to pardon me, please. Transfer it to I knew I needed one more cup of coffee. I should have waited, should have tended to that. I'm sorry. But you can transfer their refusal of Jesus to today's society the same way. People, we have been warned. We have been warned unbelievably carefully. We've seen forest fires and fires within communities that go beyond anything that we ever imagined could have happened. We've seen storm after storm after storm wreak devastation upon the land. God didn't create nature to do this. Nature is for your pleasure. Good. God will give us graciously what we don't deserve. But eventually we run out and extend to the end of His graciousness, and we begin to receive what we deserve. And this is frightful. This is scary. Pray that a nation will turn itself around. Pray that a nation will begin to look to God. Pray that a nation will take on a heart for God, to look to God, to consult God. We've spent a lot of years now working very, very hard to push God out of everything. And if certain elements within our society had their way, it would be complete. Churches would be gone. Everything would be gone that smacks of God, because the human heart has rejected Him. God is greater than all these problems. And let's keep to Him in prayer. What we can't do, He can do. And it will seem so easy once He has done it. Once we see it happen, it will have seemed so easy to what looks impossible to us, perhaps. Stay in prayer. Stay focused. Most important thing, I guess, that a Christian can do today is be a Christian. Work hard at that. Father, we thank You for Your blessing. You just go beyond anything that we have any ability to understand and appreciate. Pick up our vision. Pick up our dreams. Pick up those things that we've neglected and bring them to life again, Father, and let us live to that height. Let us live to that depth. Let us live to that wonder. Glorify Your holy name, Father. In Jesus' name we ask it. Amen.